Welcome to Dark Diaries, a new horror audio experience. If you enjoyed this episode, let me know by subscribing and liking the video version. With that out of the way, let's begin. Prepare to enter a realm of darkness and immortal legends, where the undead lurk in the shadows and feed on the blood of the living. Vampires have captured the human imagination for centuries, inspiring tales of terror, seduction, and eternal life. But what is the truth behind the vampire myth? The origins of vampire legends are as varied as they are fascinating. Some say that vampires are undead beings risen from the grave, cursed to roam the earth and prey on the living. Some even claim that vampires are shape-shifting demons, able to transform into bats or wolves. From ancient folklore to modern literature and film, they have inspired countless stories, films, and works of art. Today, we will delve into the history and legends of vampires, exploring their origins, powers, and cultural significance. We will examine the various theories about their existence, from scientific explanations to supernatural beliefs. By the end of this, we hope to have uncovered the truth behind one of the most enduring and terrifying myths of all time. So grab a wooden stake and a garlic necklace and join us on this journey into the heart of darkness. Etymology and word distribution. The word vampire is shrouded in mystery and intrigue, much like the creatures it describes. The word is believed to have originated in Eastern Europe, where it was used to describe a type of undead creature that feeds on the blood of the living. The exact origins of the word vampire are unclear, but it is believed to have originated in the Balkans, where it was associated with the folklore surrounding the undead. In Serbia and other countries in the region, it was believed that the dead could rise from their graves and were often described as having sharp fangs and a thirst for blood. The concept of the vampire has since spread far beyond the Balkans, and the word vampire is now widely recognized around the world. The spread of vampire folklore can be attributed to the popularity of vampire literature and films. The word vampire has also become a popular marketing tool, with companies using the word to sell everything from clothing to energy drinks, making it even more prevalent in popular culture. Despite its widespread use, the word vampire still carries a sense of mystery and intrigue. The idea of a creature that feeds on the blood of the living is both fascinating and terrifying, and the word itself has become synonymous with the concept of the undead. The word vampire has also been associated with historical events, particularly in the context of the vampire panic that swept across Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries. During this time, people believed that vampires were real and were responsible for spreading disease and death. This led to a widespread fear of vampires, and many people took measures to protect themselves from these supposed creatures. The word vampire has also been used to describe people who exhibit certain behaviors, such as those who drain the energy or resources of others. This use of the word is often metaphorical, but it speaks to the enduring fascination with the concept of the vampire and its ability to capture the imagination. Depiction and creating. Vampire folklore has captivated the human imagination for centuries, with depictions evolving over time and across cultures. Vampires are often characterized by their striking physical appearance, with ghastly pale skin, sharp fangs, and a predatory gaze that suggest a realm beyond human existence. Their thirst for blood is another well-known attribute, an insatiable hunger that drives them to stalk the night in search of new prey. In addition to their physical features, vampires possess a range of supernatural abilities that add to their mystique. They can transform into creatures of the night, such as bats or wolves, and can control the minds of their victims with ease. Their gaze and voice can instill fear and terror, a power that sets them apart from mere mortals. The origins of vampire beliefs are shrouded in mystery, with a complex web of cultural and religious beliefs informing their development. Many believed that those who died prematurely or under unnatural circumstances were at risk of becoming vampires, while others thought that those who lived a life of sin were also susceptible. There were also those who believed that individuals born with unique characteristics, such as a cool or red hair, could become vampires. Additionally, some believed that a person could become a vampire if they were cursed by a witch or another supernatural being. The most popular and widely recognized way of becoming a vampire is through the bite of another vampire, which infects them with their blood. This transformation is often depicted with metaphors that reflect the physical, psychological, and spiritual changes that occur during the process. It's a metamorphosis that seizes the body and soul, birthing a being that is both vampire and human, but neither entirely. The idea of vampirism as an infectious disease is steeped in the history of the spread of illnesses, which were poorly understood in medieval Europe. Diseases like the plague were thought to be caused by miasma or bad air, and people believed that they could catch or transmit diseases through contact with contaminated objects or fluids. Thus, the idea of a vampire creating another vampire through biting or infecting them with their blood became a central feature of vampire mythology, haunting our dreams and nightmares to this day. Prevention and protection. The idea of vampires has been around for centuries, and throughout history, people have developed a variety of ways to prevent themselves from turning into or being attacked by these creatures of the night. From garlic and holy symbols to silver at wooden stakes, these protective measures have been passed down through generations and have been depicted in literature, folklore, and film. One of the earliest known references to vampires can be found in ancient Mesopotamian mythology. The demon Lilitu, a female spirit that preyed upon men and infants, was said to drink the blood of her victims. To protect themselves from Lilitu, the people of Mesopotamia used incantations and amulets made of precious metals. In ancient Greek mythology, the Lamia was a female monster that was said to drink the blood of children. The Romans also believed in similar creatures, including the Strix and the Empusa. People would identify these creatures by observing abnormal behavior patterns, such as the inability to eat garlic or the avoidance of sunlight. To protect themselves, the Greeks and Romans would place a wreath of garlic on the door of their homes, as it was believed to repel these creatures. During the Middle Ages, vampires were believed to be a very real threat, and people in Europe had many ways of identifying them. Some of the methods included observing the corpses of the recently deceased. If the corpse appeared to be unusually well preserved, or if there was blood in the mouth, people would believe that the person had returned as a vampire. People would bury their dead with garlic or other protective items to prevent them from rising again as vampires. In Romania, the birthplace of the vampire legend, people would drive stakes through the hearts of suspected vampires to kill them. People would sometimes exhume bodies of the deceased and perform a variety of tests to see if they had become vampires. These tests included looking for bite marks on the body, checking for a lack of decomposition, and placing objects such as garlic and holy water near the corpse to see if they would react. While these methods may seem like superstition, there is some scientific basis for them. Garlic contains allicin, a compound that has been shown to have antibacterial and antifungal properties. This may explain why garlic was believed to have the protective powers against vampires. Similarly, silver has been used for centuries to ward off evil spirits, as it was believed to have purifying properties. Throughout history, people have developed a variety of ways to protect themselves from vampires. These protective measures have been passed down through generations and have been depicted in literature, folklore, and film. The vampire sightings and attacks of the 18th century. The 18th century was a time of great fascination and terror surrounding vampires. The belief in these creatures was fueled by countless vampire sightings and attacks that were reported across Europe. This period was marked by a flurry of vampire-related folklore, legend, and superstition. One of the most famous examples of vampire sightings and attacks in the 18th century was the case of Arnold Paul, a Serbian man who claimed to have been bitten by a vampire while working in Turkey. After returning to his village, Paul died and was buried. However, shortly thereafter, several villagers claimed to have seen him walking around the village at night, and others reported being attacked by him. In response, local authorities exhumed his body and found it to be well preserved, with fresh blood around the mouth. They proceeded to drive a stake through his heart and burn his body in an attempt to prevent further attacks. The story of Arnold Powell is just one of many similar tales from the 18th century, which helped to fuel a growing belief in vampires. This belief led many people to take preventative measures to protect themselves from vampire attacks, such as placing garlic and holy water around their homes, wearing charms or amulets, or avoiding going out at night. However, not everyone believed in the existence of vampires. Many skeptics and critics dismissed the stories of vampire sightings and attacks as mere superstition and accused those who claimed to have encountered vampires as being mentally ill or delusional. One of the most famous skeptics of the time was Johann Heinrich Zedler, a German encyclopedist who wrote a scathing critique of the vampire craze. Zedler argued that the reports of vampire sightings and attacks were nothing more than the product of an overactive imagination, and believed that the people who believed in vampires were perpetuating a dangerous and irrational belief. Despite the skepticism of some, the belief in vampires continued to spread throughout Europe. The controversy surrounding the belief in vampires reached a fever pitch in the late 18th century when a series of vampire epidemics swept across Eastern Europe. These epidemics were characterized by a sudden increase in reports of vampire sightings and attacks, which caused panic and hysteria among the local population. The vampire epidemics of the late 18th century sparked a heated debate among scholars and intellectuals about the existence of vampires. Some argued that the reports of vampire sightings and attacks were nothing more than the product of mass hysteria and superstition, while others claimed that there was a scientific basis for the belief in vampires. One of the most famous proponents of the scientific explanation of vampires was Johann Joseph von Goerez, a German writer and scholar who believed that vampires were real and they possessed a serious threat to society. Goerez argued that vampires were a type of disease that could be transmitted from one person to another, and that the only way to stop the spread of the disease was to find and kill the vampire. Of the vampire sightings, one of the most famous occurred in the village of Croglin in the north of England. After a family moved into a remote country house, they began to hear strange noises at night and noticed that their windows were often left open in the morning. One night, the daughter of the family awoke to find a pale, emaciated figure standing at the foot of her bed. The figure attacked her and left 2 marks on her neck. The family immediately left the house and never returned, but the legend of the Croglin vampire lived on. The story was later adapted into a short story by Bram Stoker, the author of Dracula. The vampire sightings and attacks of the 18th century represent a fascinating and complex period in human history. The controversy surrounding the belief in vampires highlights the ways in which superstition, folklore, and scientific inquiry can intersect and influence one another. Whether viewed as a product of mass hysteria or as a real threat to society, the vampire remains a potent symbol of the human fear of the unknown and the power of the imagination. Africa. While the popular notion of a vampire is often associated with European tales, it is fascinating to note that African cultures have their own distinct interpretation of these supernatural beings. African vampires are not merely a carbon copy of their European counterparts, rather they have their own distinct traits, methods of creation, prevention, and protection that makes them fascinating subjects of study. In African cultures, vampires are often depicted as shape-shifting beings, being able to take on the form of animals, such as bats or hyenas, or even humans. These vampires are associated with witchcraft and are believed to possess the ability to control the minds of their victims. Unlike European vampires, African vampires are not necessarily portrayed as evil, but rather as powerful and dangerous. They are often viewed as spiritual beings with a connection to the ancestral world. One of the most intriguing examples of African vampire folklore is found in the Maasai culture of Kenya and Tanzania, where vampires are known as the Pippo. According to Maasai beliefs, the Pippo are the spirits of dead warriors who have returned to seek vengeance on those who wronged them in life. They are portrayed as fearsome warriors with the power to control the minds of their victims. Similarly, in the Kikuyu culture of Kenya, vampires are known as the Wendigo. The Wendigo is said to be created when a person dies a violent death, and their spirit becomes trapped in the body. The Wendigo preys on the living, draining their life force to sustain itself. Such vampire beliefs in African cultures often reflect the belief in a connection between the dead and the living world. In addition to different depictions of vampires, African cultures have different beliefs about how vampires are created. Witchcraft is often cited as the source of the vampire's creation, with the vampire being the result of a curse or spell. In other cases, vampires are believed to be created through a person's own actions, such as committing a heinous crime or engaging in cannibalism. Such beliefs also reflect social norms and taboos, as well as fears of death and the supernatural. To prevent the creation of vampires, various measures are taken. In some cases, corpses are buried with their heads removed or turned upside down to prevent them from rising. In other cases, iron nails are driven into the feet or hands of the deceased to prevent them from walking. Objects such as mirrors, knives, and salt are placed around the body to protect it from being possessed by evil spirits. Such practices reveal the complex relationships between the living and the dead in African cultures. African cultures also have different methods of protection against vampires. In many cases, these methods involve the use of charms or amulets, such as a necklace made from the teeth of a hyena. In other cases, protective rituals are performed, such as burning incense or reciting prayers. In addition, certain animals, such as dogs and roosters, are believed to have the ability to detect and ward off vampires. Such practices reflect the role of belief in providing a sense of security against the unknown and supernatural. Some African cultures also have different beliefs about how to destroy a vampire. For instance, in the Bantu culture of southern Africa, a person can kill a vampire by driving a wooden stake through its heart. In the Akamba culture of Kenya, it is believed that a vampire can be killed by cutting off its head. African vampire folklore is rich and diverse, with many cultures throughout the continent having their own unique beliefs and depictions of these creatures. The Americas. Vampires, or creatures with vampiric qualities, have been a part of the Americas' folklore since long before the European colonialism. Native American cultures throughout North and South America had their own beliefs and legends surrounding these beings. However, with the arrival of European colonizers, new ideas and fears about vampires began to emerge, particularly in early colonial America. Depictions of vampires in early colonial America were often influenced by European beliefs and superstitions. This was especially true in New England, where the Puritan colonizers brought with them a deep-seated fear of the supernatural. In the 17th century, the Puritans believed that vampires were the result of witchcraft and devil worship, and they associated them with the undead and the devil himself. One of the most famous cases of early colonial American vampire folklore is that of Mercy Brown. In 1892, the young woman died of tuberculosis in Rhode Island, where the Brown family had already lost 2 members to the disease. It was believed that Mercy had become a vampire and was causing the illness to spread. Her body was exhumed, and her heart was burned at a ritual to prevent her from rising from the dead. Another example can be found in the vampiric panic that occurred in Connecticut in the late 1700s. Several cases of unexplained deaths led to rumours of a vampire in the area. In response, a group of men dug up the graves of several recently deceased individuals, burned their hearts, and mixed the ashes with water for the sick to drink as a cure. Various measures were taken to prevent the creation of vampires. For example, in some cases, a corpse was buried face down to prevent it from rising. Other methods included placing objects such as stones or bricks in the mouth of the deceased or driving a stake through the heart. Beliefs in vampires in early colonial America were not limited to European colonizers. Indigenous cultures throughout North and South America had their own beliefs and folklore surrounding vampiric beings. For example, the Navajo people of the Southwest believed in a creature known as the Chindi, which was said to be the spirit of a dead person that had become corrupted and could harm the living. Vampires have been a part of the Americas' folklore for centuries, with diverse cultural beliefs and legends surrounding these beings. While early colonial American vampire folklore was often influenced by European beliefs and superstitions, Native American cultures also had their own beliefs and legends surrounding these creatures. The Mercy Brown case and the Connecticut vampire panic are examples of how these beliefs took hold in early America, showcasing the different ways in which people tried to prevent the creation and spread of vampires. Asia. Vampires have long been an integral part of Asian mythology and folklore. With diverse cultures throughout the continent having their own unique beliefs and depictions of these creatures, from the blood-sucking Jinshi of China to the demonic Aswang of the Philippines. Asian vampires are often portrayed as terrifying beings with supernatural powers. One striking feature of Asian vampire folklore is the common use of the term hopping ghosts or hungry ghosts to describe these creatures. They are often depicted as pale and emaciated with long nails and sharp teeth, and are said to feed on the life force of living creatures, often by drinking their blood. They are believed to have the ability to transform into animals or control the elements, further adding to their mystique and terror. One of the most prominent examples of Asian vampire folklore is the Jiangshi, which originates from China. According to the legend, a person who dies without a proper burial or is killed by violence can transform into a hopping vampire. The Jiangshi is typically depicted wearing traditional Chinese clothing and having a paper talisman on its forehead that prevents it from moving. It hops around with its arms outstretched, seeking its next victim. Asian cultures have different beliefs about how vampires are created. In many cases, vampires are said to be the result of a curse or spell created through the use of magic or sorcery. In other cases, vampires are believed to be created through a person's own actions, such as dying without a proper burial or committing suicide. Therefore, to prevent the creation of vampires, various measures are taken, such as burying the dead with their mouths filled with rice or coins in China, or taking steps to prevent suicide in Japan. Furthermore, different methods of protection against vampires are used in Asian cultures. These methods involve the use of charms or amulets, such as a necklace made from the teeth of a tiger, or burning incense and reciting prayers. Certain animals, such as dogs and roosters, are believed to have the ability to detect and ward off vampires. While some Asian vampire beliefs may have been influenced by European folklore, many remain distinct and unique to Asian cultures, and continue to captivate and terrify. Pathology. One of the most interesting aspects of vampires is their pathology. In this chapter, we will explore the medical and psychological conditions that could have inspired the traits commonly associated with vampires. One of the most iconic traits of vampires is their sensitivity to light. In some stories, they are unable to tolerate sunlight and must avoid it at all costs. This trait may be related to a medical condition called porphyria, a group of disorders that affect the production of hem, a molecule found in blood. Porphyria can cause sensitivity to light, skin rashes, and abdominal pain, which could have been interpreted as vampiric traits in the past. While some researchers have suggested a link between porphyria and the vampire myth, others have pointed out that the disease is rare and unlikely to have been a widespread inspiration for vampire lore. Nonetheless, the connection remains intriguing. Another common trait associated with vampires is their aversion to garlic. Folklore suggests that garlic is a powerful ward against vampires, and many stories depict vampires as being repelled by the smell or taste of garlic. While there is no scientific evidence to support this belief, some researchers have speculated that it may be linked to a condition called allium phobia, a fear of garlic. However, it's important to note that garlic is also known to have antimicrobial properties, and in the past, people may have used it as a remedy for infectious diseases. This could have contributed to its association with vampires, who are often depicted as spreading disease. Vampires are also depicted as having heightened senses, particularly smell and hearing, which allow them to track their prey with ease. This trait may have been related to medical conditions such as hyperosmia, an increased sensitivity to smells, or hyperacusis, an increased sensitivity to sounds. Both of these conditions can cause individuals to perceive smells or sounds more intensely than the average person, which could have been interpreted as vampiric traits in the past. Perhaps the most well-known trait associated with vampires is their strong desire for blood, which they must consume regularly to survive. While this trait may seem fantastical, there is a real medical condition that could provide a basis for it: Renfield syndrome. Renfield syndrome is a rare psychiatric disorder that causes individuals to crave and consume blood. While the disorder is not well understood, it is believed to be linked to psychological factors such as trauma, as well as a desire for attention or sensation-seeking behaviour. It's important to note that Renfield syndrome is extremely rare and not typically associated with violent or dangerous behaviour. In some cultures, vampires are believed to be the result of a curse or disease that is passed down through generations. In the Balkan region, for example, it was believed that vampires were created when a person died and then rose from the dead to prey on the living. This belief was often linked to the spread of diseases such as tuberculosis, which could have caused people to become pale, weak, and cough up blood, symptoms that were interpreted as vampiric in nature. While many of the traits associated with vampires are rooted in folklore and mythology, there may be some real-world explanations for these phenomena. While research on psychological and social factors has provided insight into the belief in vampires and the potential mental health issues that may underlie vampiric behaviour, ultimately, the pathology of vampires is a reminder of the ways in which culture and science intersect and the enduring power of myths and legends to captivate and intrigue us. Premature burial. The fear of being buried alive, or premature burial, has been a recurring theme in vampire folklore, and has contributed to the enduring fascination with vampires. This can be traced back to the historical lack of medical knowledge and the lack of reliable methods for determining death, as well as the social and cultural taboos surrounding death and burial. In many cultures, there are numerous stories of individuals who are believed to have been buried alive and later emerged from their graves as undead creatures. These tales often involve people who have fallen into a deep sleep or coma but are mistakenly believed to be dead and are buried prematurely. Once they are awoken and find themselves trapped in their coffins, they claw their way out of their graves and are mistaken for vampires. One example of this phenomenon can be found in the story of Peter Polagojewicz. In 1725, Polagojewicz, a farmer from a small village in Serbia, died suddenly and was buried in the local cemetery. A few days later, several villagers reported seeing him walking through the town, and soon after, several people died suddenly. The villagers became convinced that he had returned from the dead as a vampire, and was responsible for the deaths. They exhumed his body and found that it appeared to be in a state of decomposition, except for the fact that his beard and nails had continued to grow. This was seen as evidence that he was indeed a vampire, and his body was subsequently burned to prevent him from rising again. The fear of premature burial has also led to the development of various methods for ensuring that people who were buried were actually dead. In the 19th century, several inventions were created, such as the safety coffin, which allowed people to signal for help if they were buried alive. These coffins were equipped with bells or other devices that could be activated by someone inside the coffin, alerting those above ground that they were still alive. In fact, some modern technologies have been developed to alleviate the fear of being buried alive, such as wearable devices that monitor vital signs and can alert emergency services if necessary. The fear of premature burial has been a recurring theme in vampire folklore, and has been contributed to the enduring fascination with vampires. The lack of medical knowledge and reliable methods for determining death in the past, as well as the social and cultural taboos surrounding death and burial, have given rise to these beliefs and practices. The stories of people rising from their graves as vampires, and the development of various methods for ensuring that people who were buried were actually dead, illustrate the deep-seated fear of death and the desire to avoid the possibility of being buried alive. The concept of premature burial serves as a metaphor for the fear of death and the unknown. Vampires, as undead creatures, embody this fear and are often portrayed as a manifestation of our anxieties about morality. The vampire's ability to rise from the dead and prey upon the living represents the fear of death and the possibility of an afterlife that is both terrifying and seductive. Political interpretations. The appeal of vampires extends beyond just cultural and psychological realms. Throughout history, vampires have also been used as symbols for various political ideologies and movements. One of the most famous examples of political interpretation of vampires is found in Bram Stoker's Dracula, published in 1897 during the Victorian era, a time when the British Empire was at its peak. The novel features a foreign vampire, Count Dracula, who invades England to prey on the innocent and corrupt the country. This can be seen as a representation of fear of foreign invasion and the need to protect the purity of the British race and culture. In this way, Dracula can be interpreted as a symbol of British imperialism as the British Empire expanded its reach across the world. Another political interpretation of vampires is the portrayal of them as aristocrats. In many vampire stories, the vampire is depicted as a wealthy and powerful individual who has control over the lives of others. This can be interpreted as a commentary on the social inequalities in which the aristocracy has power over the common people. Vampires are often depicted as the ultimate manifestation of this power dynamic, as they can literally control their victims and drain them of their life force. During the 20th century, vampires were used as symbols for political ideologies such as communism and fascism. In the Soviet Union, for example, vampires were often used as a metaphor for the bourgeoisie, the wealthy class that owned the means of production. In this way, the vampire represents the capitalist oppressors who exploited the working class. Similarly, in fascist propaganda, vampires were often used as a symbol for the Jewish people, who were seen as a parasitic force that drained the blood and resources of the nation. In more recent times, vampires have been used as symbols for marginalized communities. This can be seen in the works of Anne Rice's The Vampire Chronicles and the TV series True Blood. In these stories, vampires are often portrayed as outsiders who have to hide their true nature from society, much like members of the LGBT community have to hide their identities. In this way, vampires have become a symbol of otherness and the struggle for acceptance in a society that does not understand or accept differences. The political interpretation of vampires can also be seen in the way that they are portrayed in popular culture. In many movies and TV shows, vampires are depicted as glamorous and alluring, with a seductive power that draws people to them. This can be seen as a commentary on the power of the media and advertising to manipulate people's desires and beliefs. In this way, vampires can be seen as a symbol of the consumer culture that dominates modern society. Moreover, some scholars have analysed the political interpretations of vampire mythology itself. James Twitchell argues that the vampire mythology is inherently political because it deals with the idea of immortality, which is a central concern of political philosophy. He suggests that vampires represent the desire for eternal life and the fear of death, which are issues that have been long debated by political thinkers. Modern culture. There have been countless examples of vampire depictions in literature, film, television, and more recently, video games. Over the years, the portrayal of vampires has evolved, reflecting changes in society's values and fears, as well as advancements in technology and storytelling. The literary portrayal of vampires can be traced back to the 18th century, with works such as John Polidori's The Vampire. However, it was Bram Stoker's Dracula that popularized the modern vampire mythos and set the template for future vampire stories. In Dracula, vampires were portrayed as aristocratic, cultured figures, with an air of mystery and danger. The titular character was a suave, intelligent figure who seduced his victims with his charm and charisma, before ultimately consuming them. This portrayal of vampires as sophisticated, aristocratic figures continued through much of the early 20th century, with authors such as Anne Rice and Tanith Lee exploring the darker, more gothic side of vampire mythology. In Rice's Interview with a Vampire, vampires were depicted as tortured, immortal beings struggling to come to terms with their existence, while Lee's The Blood of Roses explored themes of addiction and obsession. The cinematic portrayal of vampires began in the early 20th century with films such as Nosferatu and Todd Brownings's Dracula. These films cemented the image of vampires as dark, mysterious figures and set the stage for future depictions in film and television. In the 60s and 70s, a new breed of vampire emerged, one that was more rebellious, sexy, and dangerous than their aristocratic forebearers. Films such as The Lost Boys and Near Dark portrayed vampires as leather-clad outcasts, prowling the streets and living on the fringes of society. In the 80s and 90s, the portrayal of vampires took a more sensual turn, with films such as Interview with the Vampire and Bram Stoker's Dracula exploring the erotic and romantic side of vampire mythology. These films were notable for their lavish costumes and production design, as well as their A-list casts, which included Tom Cruise, Brad Pitt, Gary Oldman, and Winona Ryder. The advent of television brought a new wave of vampire stories, with shows such as Buffy the Vampire Slayer and Angel becoming hugely popular in the late 90s and early 2000s. These shows portrayed vampires as complex, multi-dimensional characters with their own hopes, fears, and desires. They also explore themes of power, control, and the struggle between good and evil. In more recent years, shows such as True Blood and The Vampire Diaries have taken a darker, more violent turn, with vampires depicted as dangerous, unpredictable creatures who exist on the fringes of society. These shows explore themes of addiction, discrimination, and the nature of power, and are notable for their unflinching depictions of violence and sexuality. The portrayal of vampires in popular culture has evolved significantly over the years, reflecting changes in society's values, fears, and tastes. From the aristocratic cultured vampires of the early 20th century to the rebellious sexy vampires of the 60s and 70s and the complex multi-dimensional vampires of modern television, vampires have remained a potent symbol of our fascination with the supernatural and the unknown. Despite their various portrayals, vampires have always been represented as something more than just blood-sucking monsters. They embody our deepest fears and desires, our struggle for power and control, and our fascination with the unknown and the forbidden. They represent our desire for immorality and our fear of death, our longing for connection and our fear of isolation. As we continue to explore the world of vampires in literature, film, television, and video games, it is clear that their legacy will endure for generations to come, inspiring new generations of storytellers to push the boundaries of our collective imagination and explore the darkest corners of our souls. Conclusion. For nearly a millennium, vampires have been a haunting and beguiling figure in human culture, captivating and terrifying our imaginations with their eternal allure. From the ancient folklore of Eastern Europe to modern-day literature and film, vampires have maintained a consistent and enduring presence in popular culture, leaving an indelible mark on our collective psyche. Perhaps one of the reasons for this longevity is the enduring appeal of the vampire's seductive powers. With their hypnotic gaze and otherworldly beauty, vampires possess an irresistible magnetism that draws in both their victims and their audiences. Their supernatural abilities and immortality evoke a sense of awe and envy as we long to possess such power and control over our own lives. But with this power comes a dark and dangerous side, as vampires are also associated with death, bloodlust, and the fear of the unknown. Their cold, lifeless bodies and insatiable thirst for blood strike a primal chord within us, triggering our most basic fears of mortality and the unknown. In many ways, the vampire represents the ultimate form of taboo, transgressing the boundaries of life and death, good and evil, and blurring the lines between human and monster. Perhaps this is why vampires have been such a prevalent figure in folklore and myth for centuries. From the Slavic to the Chinese, cultures around the world have long been fascinated with the concept of the undead and the supernatural powers they possess. These tales often serve as cautionary tales, warning us against the dangers of temptation and the perils of excess. In more recent times, vampires have taken on a new form in popular culture, appearing in everything from literature to film and television. From Bram Stoker's Dracula to Stephenie Meyer's Twilight series, vampires have become a ubiquitous part of our modern-day mythos, inspiring countless books, movies, and television shows. But why do we continue to be drawn to these immortal creatures of the night? Perhaps it is because they allow us to explore our deepest desires and darkest fears in a safe and controlled environment. Through the lens of the vampire, we can confront our own mortality, our own inner demons, and our own desires for power and control, exploring our own darker impulses without risking the consequences. In many ways, the vampire serves as a mirror of our own humanity, reflecting back to us our deepest desires and fears. As we continue to grapple with our own mortality and search for meaning and purpose in an uncertain world, the vampire remains a timeless and compelling figure, haunting and alluring in equal measure. Hello, Alex here. Thank you so much for making it this far into the pilot episode of Dark Diaries, a brand new adventure that I'm so excited about. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe and give some feedback. There's a lot of exciting things on the way, one of which is this. Episode 2, The Lost Colony of Roanoke. See you soon.